rocks could speak, if those giants could sing, they'd never talk of themselves, no. They'd always boast of the giant's king. They'd tell the deeds that he's done. They'd never brag of their own. They bow their giant shoulders to his giant throne.
Welcome to the Book Distillery, episode 3. We are the Blue Collar Scholars discussing books that matter, and we're going to have a great night. Please, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel, like this video, comment. If you disagree with something, let's hear it and we can engage in healthy discussion. Tonight's meeting will be chaired by our dear friend Geoffrey, and I'm going to pass over to him without further ado, and he can introduce our special guest. Over to you, Geoffrey.
Thanks very much, Henry. So, as well as our kind of normal contributors this evening, so we've got Henry, we've got Richard, Andy, Ben. We're also very privileged to have a special guest for this evening, and it's quite special, actually, because a real theme for the book that we're looking at the moment, so that's Saving Europe by Henry Vyner-Brooks, is the theme of kind of mentorship and succession and transmission from one generation to the next. We see that right the way through from medieval monks and later on into the 20th century as well, which we'll start to cover a little bit this evening. So it's really nice to have Richard Russell here with us this evening as well. So Richard was a mentor for Richard, the other Richard on our call. Richard has taught the history of philosophy, the history of education. He was a vicar for many years as well. And so many of the themes that we're going to be talking about this evening are really kind of tapping into Richard's expertise. So it'll be great to have his insights as we start talking about Nietzsche and some other philosophers, but then also kind of the spiritual impact and element there as well. So Richard Russell, it's great to have you here on the Distillery this evening.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we're up to chapter 3 in Saving Europe. And by way of kind of setting the context and starting the scene, Andrew found some fun facts for us about the year 1886. So if we're kind of transported back in time, about 140 years, Andy, do you want to share just kind of a few extracts of what's happening in the world at this point? So this is the year when Robert Schuman is born. Schuman is the second character in this two-part biography by Henry. So Andy, what's happening in 1886?
Yeah, so as I was looking around, I discovered that 1886 is the same year that in the New York Harbor, the US President, Grover Cleveland, dedicates the Statue of Liberty, Liberty enlightening the world. It was a gift from France. The same year, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote his novella, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And an American pharmacist, Dr. John Pemberton, invents a carbonated beverage that we now call Coca-Cola. Simultaneously, invention is shrinking the world as Carl Benz patents the first successful gasoline-driven automobile. The first train, loaded with oranges, leaves Los Angeles via the United States Transcontinental Railroad. Wilhelm Steinitz becomes the first recognised world chess champion, and the London Association football club Arsenal play their first match. It is also a time and period of history when important groups are started, such as Johnson & Johnson, and begins manufacturing healthcare products in New Jersey in the US. And last, but definitely not least, Yorkshire tea is established in Harrogate in England. So Awesome. It's a year of change, moving forwards, looking at the future. It's a time of connectivity, international relation, but it's also a time of new ideas. And this is the spread of these new ideas in this connected world that we're discussing in this new chapter here of Schuman's life.
Thanks, Andy.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Thank you. So on that theme then of kind of background and the birth and the early childhood of Schuman, perhaps I don't know, maybe Ben, did you have any kind of questions or thoughts to kind of kick us off? Maybe a summary of the kind of the beginning of the chapter, or anything that we want to direct at Richard?
Well, as a summary of the chapter, I thought there was a few themes that run through it. We have this story developing of this young boy that's born that's going to have an interesting impact on the world thereafter, into an interesting political situation. At the what is the tipping point, perhaps could be said, of the start of the end of the British Empire in its fullness. And then there's this, I think these are the things that stood out to me. There's this interesting discussion that starts at the beginning of this chapter of kind of, there's a losing of Christian value, of Christian worldview, and a secularist narrative that comes in. And Henry kind of posits at the start that was in some ways related to the negative destruction that then took place over the next 100 years, and makes a few interesting cases for that. And then secondly, in the second half of the chapter, there's this interesting discussion of the proper formation, I say, of nationalism, of where does that sit in tension, love for one's country, and where does it reach excess? I think he makes this case that the schools of Nietzsche and Marx and this secularist philosophy and schools of thought leads to a bunch of things which culminates in the deaths of about 300 million people, and that is something that is tied into the lack of an acceptance or respect for Christian philosophy. And then Henry also makes some interesting cases throughout this chapter for what that would be. So first of all is a lack of religious commonality between people. People are now quite different between nations because there isn't a unifying religious outview is across Europe as a starting place, at least, that there's not that this is my Christian brother or sister, this is just a person from another nation. Another thing that another point that Henry makes is this thing about the Christian view as man as created by God, and there's some things that are unchangeable, or he cannot make himself as he wishes to be, which I think holds up to a number of levels of scrutiny. His conscience, his interests being two of those, and the wonderful passage from T.S. Eliot. The third one, this belief that evil is external. Central to the Christian worldview is that good and evil is a wrestle, to borrow a line from someone else, that the line between good and evil runs down the center of every human heart. And in the losing of that, in this otherness, in saying evil is done by other people with a different worldview, so I can oppose that, leads to destruction because you're opposing a person now, not an idea. And you could fix these issues by not having to address anything within oneself, even to the extent of the eradication of a population that's been associated with evil. Henry also makes the case that this leads to a view on eugenics. There isn't kind of the moral protection around human beings, and a lack of meddling, I suppose. And I was quite surprised to read myself that this wasn't subtle. This was actually talked about. We can improve humans through genetic modeling and selective breeding stuff. So that's a whole bunch of things. Things that are coming up in this period, the conversations that are being had, the views that are being adopted off the back of, to Richard's point, starting at the level of the academic into the popular society, that results in chaos.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ben. So Richard Russell, what do you think is really important for us and for the listeners to know when we start looking at this kind of period? So we're at about 1886 and then up into the early 20th century. What's going on in terms of philosophy? What are people thinking? What are the religious movements? What's the kind of what's the spirit of the age, so to speak? What's going on here?
Oh,
huge question.
Yes. Obviously, things go on in different areas of culture and in different countries and at different social classes at different speeds. Often that which is present amongst the intellectual elite can take a generation to soak down, but surely it will, and it does as well. I think it doesn't bear on so much on the European situation, but in Britain generally, although Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were, as it were, didn't move as fast as England. What you had happening there is a rapid, I think, two things. One was you feel as though the Christian movement generally had sort of run out of steam. The mid-19th century, a sort of generalized Christianity had sort of largely dominated the culture. It was a reference point for most people. By 1870, things had changed. The vision for the transformation of culture, which had been present, say, with the Clapham sect and Shaftesbury and those people, lots and lots of their ideas had been incorporated and became part of legislation, attitudes, and whatever. But there was like an exhaustion by about 1870. And so instead of a transformation of the cultural, social and economic world, which had been present before, fueled by a sort of general post-millennialism, I think, this was exhausted, and there was a turning inwards to a private pietism, my personal holiness, my walk with Jesus, and I really like being in beautiful landscape with lakes and sunsets, and I really want to turn my back on the agonies of industrialized England and all the teeming intellectual questions about the faith which were coming through from Darwinism, higher criticism, and a resurgent Enlightenment outlook, which had been very much repressed by the evangelical awakening of the late 18th, 19th century, Methodism, and all those things. Repression had sort of, as it were, come to an end, and resurgent secularism had come up. And so instead of engaging intellectually and culturally with this, evangelicals really fled into inwardness, to private pieties, to revival meetings, and very much because of the influence of dispensationalism, there was a deep cultural pessimism. The world is going to the dogs. This is what God said would happen in the Bible. There's nothing we can do to put on brakes or slow it down, or certainly not reverse it. Moody said the world is like a big liner, and it's sinking. And he came over to Britain, I think, 2 or 3 times, spoke at Oxford students, Cambridge students, Edinburgh, big mass meetings all over the place. And he said that, the world is finished. The future of the world is judgment and fire and annihilation, effectively. God has given me a little lifeboat, and I'm going around rescuing as many as possible. So the only thing the Christian church should be doing, only thing Christians should do, the only thing of eternal significance is soul saving, doing them from the water. Think Titanic, okay?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. I was just thinking, I don't want to pass over this point too quickly, because I'm thinking when we look at the lives of people like Columbanus or Schuman, I'm thinking Schuman particularly, that's what we're talking about tonight, is the unexpected possibilities of renewal happening. And we're about to witness in this book the hand of God, in an extraordinary way in the life of politicians, and I just wanted the boys to chip in and sort of ask more about that. I mean, firstly about the resurgent, let's say, neo-secularism, and then also, because I've not really considered that aspect in late Victorian Britain, but also, just about this pietism, which...
May I make an observation, Joe?
Yeah.
Just from what Richard was saying, is that one of the ironies of this period when he's born is that just as the Jews are coming out of the ghettos, just as the 19th century, things are peaking. Britain's got a Jewish prime minister just before this, and the first vision for the promised land belonging to the Jews again, Zionism is being born. The Jews are coming out of the ghetto and are hugely influential in culture. We've got Marx already writing in Britain, but we've also got Freud, Einstein, and the enormous explosion of Jewish thought in the 20th century. So just as the Jews are coming out of the ghetto, the Christians are going into one. The Christians are going into a set of ghettos. The Catholic Church is turning inwards largely for a century, and the Protestants, as you say, are getting very pietistic, very otherworldly. So it's ironic that as the Jews come out, the Christians retreat.
I don't know how it would be otherwise, in a sense, where you have a privileged state cult. When, like, Schuman and Adenauer, they form. Well, like, Adenauer has to stop the Zentrum, the Catholic Party, and reform a new. So does De Gasperi, on new sort of non. He calls it the absolutist era is over, and they needed to reorientate after the war. And it was very controversial what Adenauer would do, starting the CDU, the Christian Democrat Party, but he realized that they needed a broader consensus. It's someone else.
Richard, there was a mention in the footnotes of this chapter of Doyeweerd. Henry references Doyeweerd's theory, but of course he's coming from Kuyper. Kuyper is a good example of an exception to the rule of Christians retreating from the public square. Richard, would you mind telling us a little bit about Kuyper?
Yes. Well, I mean, Kuyper himself, born in 1837, to a reasonably prosperous family. His father was a pastor in a Reformed church in the Netherlands. And he went through university right through, got his doctorate in theology. And the whole agenda was very liberal and secularist. He said he remembers making jokes about the resurrection. None of this, all the New Testament, Old Testament supernatural stuff really has to, is really no longer credible. And it was when he for two things, he started doing historical research into especially the Reformation period, and began to think what they believed in their Reformed churches in Holland is so different from where we are. It's not just that we're just a modification and modernization of that, but actually we are the elimination of that. What's going on in our thoughts and whatever. The other thing is he was posted out to some obscure little village out in the marshes of Holland where they all wore clogs. If you know Van Gogh's paintings drawing the potato eaters, lumpy peasants and whatever. And lo and behold, he found himself in a community which was full of real Christian believers who knew their Bible. They weren't educated folk, they were literate and knowledgeable and lived in the scriptures.
Wow.
And there was one particularly feisty young woman who, more or less after every sermon he preached, would go on the attack. And the nicest, sweetest possible way, but disturbed and unsettled him. And through that and some other circumstances, he came to a realization of Jesus, of the truth of the Bible. It all became alive to him. God spoke to him very, very powerfully. But instead of just saying theological education in the Reformed Church is crap, we need to set up some good Bible colleges to teach people the Bible in a good conservative orthodox way, he said, good grief. Yes, that's true, but that's true of university education in all the disciplines. It's true of the politics, the arts, the culture, the media, the whole lot. The Christian heritage of Holland has gone. It's been replaced by secularism. There's a task now, and that is confronting all of it. Christianity, he said, is a total worldview, not an additional piety or church practice or something added on to ordinary life, to secular life. He said there is no secular, everything belongs to God. In fact, the phrase Kuyper used, there's not a square inch of life or reality of which Christ does not say, it is mine. Okay, so what does he do? Sets up a newspaper, becomes the leader of a little fledgling Christian political party, opens the Free University of Amsterdam as their think tank in 1880. Eventually, around the end of the 19th century, in a coalition of his, there's also a breakaway from the Reformed Church into a re-Reformed Church. And around the turn of the century, there's a coalition with the Catholic political party, and he becomes Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Okay? And even today, so much of the thinking and reorganizing of life and reinvisiting of life, which Kuyper and his successors at the Free University and in different areas of culture did, are still present as a confessional pluralism and whatever, even though deep secularism has been on the rampage really for perhaps the last 40 or 50 years in Holland. So here was someone, instead of turning away, like in Britain, turning to inwardness and piety and spirituality, or like the Anglo-Catholic tradition, staying inside the stained glass and wishing they were in the Middle Ages, and the evangelicals too, of course. Instead of the other direction, it was the inward one, inward piety. That's good, but the fight didn't happen here. Again, let's think of it. 1870, basically, the Church of England gives up Oxford and Cambridge, which it owned, and no longer is it any pretense of being a Christian university where you had to sign the 39 Articles of the Church of England to go. It's like given up on the life of the mind of culture, of cultural responsibility. So that's just a bit about Kuyper. And of course, I thoroughly stand in that line. And it was the work of the Kuyperian tradition, which I encountered 3 weeks after my conversion to the faith at Aberystwyth at the end of my first year. Kuyper doesn't want a good theological department, of the university or a separate Bible college. He wants a university because Christianity is a worldview which relates to every area of life, and that every discipline, without exception, including mathematics, the natural sciences, psychology, of disciplines. Economics, sociology, psychology, whatever. I mean, they sort of existed in all sorts of ways, and a lot of them you can go back to Aristotle in terms of the name of the discipline or something like that. But they were, things were resurgent in the 19th century, and they took on, they began to get, Thomas Kuhn, the word paradigm, they began to get disciplinary paradigms. You had professorships set up, departments, journals to do with that discipline. You went there to become inducted into that discipline, become a professional in that field, degrees in it, etc., etc. And all that was happening. And Kuyper was saying, we have got to be playing that same game too in the name of Christ, because the gospel is good news for not just people or souls or culture generally or morality, but it's good news for institutions, and it's good for news for disciplines. Because what he saw was that if your orientation wasn't to the Lord God as the ultimate reality on which all creaturely reality depended, you would fixate on an aspect or a few aspects of created reality, make that absolute, and then see every other aspect of reality as being features either unreal or functions of those idolized aspects. And he saw immediately that all the isms that you get intellectually, that sort of fixation, the isms are intellectual idolatry, but then you get those idolatries going on within disciplines, so you get schools of thought within the disciplines and whatever. So Kuyper could see that there was a sort of comprehensive encyclopedic task to do within education and scholarship, and also that would also have all sorts of implications for the working out of all the disciplines and their development free from distorting idolatry. And of course, you can see what's happened since then. Either you'll get a powerful ism, like in Soviet universities, where you had Marxism dominated the whole curriculum systematically, and where that fails to happen, where you get a worldview, but it's only present in perhaps one or two disciplines, and another worldview in other disciplines, what you end up with a fragmentation. And so you get the modern multiversity, because you get, if you look at the different disciplines, you'll find the dominant philosophical views behind them are quite different. And there's no way of holding those together. The students are just, they're dumped.
Incommensurate.
There's no coherence there. So,
yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Thank you. There's some fantastic phrases and thoughts in there. So like, I think, all of us have kind of, one way or another in our conversations talked about, our different aspect, I suppose, of culture that we're all kind of, not just reflecting inwardly, but actually, what can we kind of project outwardly? What can we look to shift and change? I think the phrase popped into mind of, the dark satanic mills, kind of that sort of, to what extent actually are we sometimes guilty of thinking, oh, that's a little bit outside my remit. I'll try and ignore those dark, messy bits, and I'll sit in my nice, cozy chair and do something nice. That's super interesting, and I think we'll probably see more and more of in Schuman's life as we go on. To be honest, I haven't read all the rest of the book yet, so I'm still kind of excited to find out what Schuman does. But my impression is that he doesn't do that, and I'm excited to see kind of what the long-lasting impact and legacy of that is. I don't know if Ben or Andy had any questions to kind of throw into the mix here. We're going to be moving on from kind of the context around Schumann's life and think a little bit more about kind of the philosophy. So Nietzsche and some of these people that we've mentioned in briefing. But Ben, Andy, any questions, any thoughts? I had
a list of things that I wanted to talk about today, and especially from this chapter, kind of why is it that we take this view that it's the lack of Christian thought that leads to this thing turning into this thing, which is clearly bad. And the thing that I wanted to package all that with is something that I feel myself kind of balk at recently, which is this kind of smug Christian saccharine declaration of victory. And I don't know how to describe it other than it's almost coming from this place of entitlement of like, I found enough for me to accept this. What a wonderful thing. And now I get to smugly smile at the world and tell them they're wrong from this place of utter blessing, really. And I feel quite sensitive to, I'm not in relation to anything to covered so far. And so that was why I was really interested when we came to this chapter to hear those kind of propositions of the things that I do believe are true, and then also fleshed out on a number of levels. And I really liked, I don't know you very well yet, but I like that thought of it is worth engaging, and almost from a sense of, if it is real, if it is true, if it is good, then it holds up to every level of scrutiny, and like good salt, it beautifies and it preserves and protects what is good about what it meets, as opposed to rots it. And so there's a quote from this chapter that I just thought was an absolute cracker. I don't know if it was phrased by Henry or him himself, which is, Nietzsche has already warned us that the non-Christian of the modern world has no realization of what it truly meant to be without Christ. And what a cracking quote that is for me, of perhaps a question for yourself on, it's a broad one, but perhaps the philosophical take of the day, because I do think there's something about that is true, that there's things about the sanctity of human life, the nature of a human being that comes up in this chapter. So yeah, that question, Nietzsche has warned us that the non-Christian of the modern world had no realization of what it truly meant to be without Christ. Be interested in your thoughts. Yeah.
I've got separate volumes of Nietzsche, but this is my portable Nietzsche here, and you can see someone needs to buy me a new one for Christmas.
A well-thumbed copy.
Okay. A much underlined copy. There's a little quote here. I mean, you possibly in the book, I've only read the chapter I was told to so far. There's the famous "God is dead" quote, and that's an amazing dramatic passage. But there's another little thing in one of his books called the book is called "The Twilight of the Idols." It's talking about the novelist George Eliot, talking about the English blockheads, and he said, they are rid of the Christian God, and now they believe all the more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality. That is an English consistency we would not wish to hold against little moralistic females a la Eliot. George Eliot was a woman. She wrote under a man's name because it was easier to get published like that. In England, one must rehabilitate oneself after every little emancipation from theology by showing a veritably awe-inspiring manner what a moral fanatic one is. That is the penance they must pay there. We hold otherwise. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. This point has to be exhibited again and again, despite the English flatheads. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know what is good for him, what is evil. He believes in God, who alone knows it. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendent. It is beyond all criticism or right to criticism. It has truth only if God is the truth. It stands or falls with faith in God. When the English actually believe that they know intuitively what is good and evil, when they therefore suppose that they no longer require Christianity as a guarantee of morality, we are merely witnessing the effects of the dominion of the Christian value judgment and an expression of that strength and the depth of this dominion, such that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, such that the very conditional character of the right to its existence is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem.
Yeah.
So
brilliant. That's an excellent passage.
That Christianity is a system, a whole view of things. That's exactly what Kuyper was saying more or less at the same time. And in fact, a wonderful PhD thesis could be done, a critical comparison of Kuyper and Nietzsche, because in many ways they had very much the same sort of cultural background, and they came to diametrically opposed positions. May I say a little bit about Nietzsche, if I can, about his background?
Yeah, please do.
He came from a line of Lutheran pastors, brought up in a pious household. His dad died quite young, and so he was brought up by his mum and about 3 or 4 sisters. And probably a lot of lacy curtains and things. I could just imagine
doilies.
The environment. Anyway, he was sent to a Lutheran academy. I think it was like a public school sort of thing, sent away there. I think he was sent away, yes. A very top flight place, intellectually, incredibly high standards. You just sailed into top German universities if you've been there. This was a Christian academy, lots of religion and whatever, but the curriculum was very largely Greek and Roman classics. The curriculum, the stuff you read, was pagan. Greco-Roman classical pagan stuff. Okay, just think about that. This is strange, isn't it? Here we have, a very Christian school in every other sort of way. Lots of religion and services and strict moralities and, all that sort of stuff. And right at the heart, the stuff you labor over 9 to 5 or whatever the hours were, is writings by pagans. This is what it is to be educated, cultured, to know this stuff, to soak it in. All this guff and nonsense about the glory which was Greece and Rome. Okay? Well, he does. He's a good student. When he encounters the Greek stuff, it isn't the later Greek stuff he falls in love with. The Plato and the Aristotle, the noble idealistic realm of forms, intellectualism, beautiful sculpture, classical columns, all the paraphernalia of Greek culture. He likes the early stuff in Homer and the Iliad, where the Greeks were effectively warring tribes. Closest analogy locally would be Scottish clans in the olden days, right? And he loves the ruthlessness, the butchery, the might is right aspects of that. It's utterly different from this moralistic little world of genteel middle-class females that he lived in at home. Okay? It's utterly, utterly different. It's a world of masculinity and violence and power and, of masters and slaves, of a sense of who the true aristocrats are. Aristos the best people were ones with the power, and they trample over and used the rest for whatever purposes. He loved that, and he thought that Christianity was this cult of niceness and kindness, looking out for underdogs and sick people and ill people and lepers, and he thought this was appalling. The power, this just didn't appeal to, ruthless alpha males in the slightest. These people didn't deserve to exist, or they existed to be your slaves. Okay? And so basically what Nietzsche embraced was a sort of neo-paganism. So, and this came out of his Christian education.
There is another factor, though, that his encounter with Schopenhauer, he wandered into a secondhand bookshop when he was quite young as a philologist studying the classics, and picked up Schopenhauer's great book from 1819, The World as Will and Representation, which is the first openly atheist work in Western philosophy, because Hume never quite goes atheist. Of course, the French Enlightenment do, but Schopenhauer's a big name at this time in the 1880s. Everyone's reading Schopenhauer. It blew Nietzsche away, and it kind of liberated him. He thought, oh, right, so I don't have to be Christian. I can look at these classics through a sort of liberated ancient philosophy, because Schopenhauer's atheist, but he's also very fond of Hinduism. So it's a non-Western, it's getting him out of Christendom. And I think the Schopenhauer was like a sort of torpedo of a lot of the Christian assumptions that Nietzsche had. It freed him up to embrace the classics in a pagan way, a pre-Christian way.
Yeah.
And the thing with Schopenhauer is everyone at the time is getting into Schopenhauer. Like our Thomas Hardy is soaked in Schopenhauer, and he's teaching Schopenhauer through his novels to millions of readers in English, and they're getting translated. And Conrad, of course, Joseph Conrad comes up. I think Henry mentions him in the next chapters.
Hardy.
Yeah, Hardy. I said Hardy. Hardy, Conrad, of course, Richard Wagner. Everyone, all the musical elite are obsessed with Wagner. Musician after musician is inspired by Wagner, and he's soaked in Schopenhauer and knew him. So it's there's a lot of sort of secular evangelism going on, and Nietzsche's in that context.
Thank you. Richard, did you have something? Richard Betts.
Oh, I keep thinking things to say. Talking of English blockheads, that lovely quote from Nietzsche. I was thinking of Richard Sorry?
I said blockheads, he actually says flatheads.
No, I thought he called Miller blockhead, but
he probably used both ones.
Yeah.
Flathead, I guess you'd be cut off about here with your brain removed.
But he's just basically saying they're inconsistent, like that long quote you shared with us. And we want to drop the Christian creed, but we don't want to keep the Christian morality. And it's amazing how the English-speaking world is still there with that basic. I mean, look at the European Union today. We don't want to be Christian, but we want all the products of Christianity. We want the goodies, but we don't want to invest. And I was thinking of Richard Dawkins, actually, as a wonderful manifestation of that blockheadedness that is still alive and kicking. I saw a wonderful documentary with him. I've seen some very funny, well, I find them very funny documentaries of Richard Dawkins. And he was being asked, well, if given your atheist worldview that there is just atoms and it's all an accident and we've come from nowhere and it's all chance, how do you justify your liberal politics? Because he's got a very, he's very much a funder of the Liberal Party and he has a political take. And he just said, well, I choose to. I think it's right. It's like he had absolutely no defense. And I thought that summarized everything since Nietzsche, really. It's just that we have no justification. We just think it's freedom and equality are important, but we can't explain why. And I thought, so you like liberalism and freedom, you like strawberry ice cream, and you like genocide, and they're all equally valid. And I just thought Dawkins' stupidity, it was like the top of his head was missing. Amazing.
I think I've heard him refer to himself as a cultural Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, I know quite a lot of Jewish people who are cultural Jews, who are sort of atheists, but also participate in the cultural life and the religious life of the Jewish community at the same time. And I think Dawkins has been known to sneak into evensongs in Oxford because he likes the music and the ambience and thoughts.
It's interesting that T.H. Huxley, I think, T.E., the original Darwin's bulldog, said, I don't advocate, talking about Christianity and morality, I do not advocate burning the ship because it has cockroaches. So he believed that eventually we would be able to come to some autonomous system of ethics. He just thought it was just, it was very early in the 1860s. Give us time. And of course, we literally have not moved on 1 inch from that. And it's like the elephant in the room, isn't it, really?
But talking of cultural Christians, I mean, there's a certain validity to secularization and pluralization, because if Christianity does what it says on the tin, then it will be fair to all different confessional groups. So I was surprised, Richard, when you said the Church of England you implied that the Church of England shouldn't have let go of Oxford and Cambridge, but given the history of the Anglican establishment and its total hegemony over the English mind, it seems only fair that they should let go, because London University was founded by fierce humanists who were saying, why should the Church of England run higher education? So there's a sense in which it was valid to let go.
I would have wanted to say, I mean, if you look at what happened after the Commonwealth period under Charles II, that's right, was that basically non-Anglicans were sort of banished from participating in the public realm, couldn't go to university, couldn't be army officers, couldn't hold official appointments, couldn't. They were marginalized, and it wasn't until I think 1870 that nonconformists, atheists, or anyone else was able to attend Oxford, etc. So, I mean, that whole process, and also, of course, there's the Great Ejection. There's about 2,000 of the best ministers in the churches of England were thrown out as well under Charles I as well. So there shouldn't, but what I was arguing, I mean, what should have happened with the Church of England, being monopolistic was wrong, or being part of the arrangement, but they didn't really, they were effectively a state church. So they didn't determine that themselves. What should have happened is the reformation of scholarship in the Church of England. But what was Church of England doing? What was Oxford and Cambridge doing? Mostly teaching classics again. Remember Nietzsche and some mathematics and a few other bits and pieces. But to a huge measure, certainly in the 18th century, Oxford and Cambridge were just the playgrounds of the rich, where you filled in a few years before going on the grand tour or, going into the church or the army or one of the, the law professions or inheriting the family estates or whatever. And in fact, in non-conformist academies, which had been set up in the 17th century and round through the 18th century, providing infinitely superior education during that time and a much richer curriculum as well. So what there wasn't was a sense that, let's take it back, there was a notion of what reason and scholarship and understanding and science was, and the view which had come right down through the Greeks had come down in modified form in the Middle Ages. So you got, in the ancient world, theoria, and then you got ratio naturalis, natural reason, and then sort of reason in the modern world, Enlightenment type reason and whatever. The idea that this was religiously neutral, worldview neutral, that all reasonable men, and it would be men because slaves, women and children really were marginalized as being intellectually defective, and that's been a very powerful tradition which has gone on from the ancient Greeks to today effectively. Could by appeal to evidence and argument come to universally valid conclusions. Okay, so that was the assumption right the way through. So we get rid of prejudices, dogmas, anything a priori, get all that gunk out of the way, traditions, and whatever, and we can think for ourselves and we can come to universal agreement. And also that will guarantee universal agreement about what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, what is just, and therefore we can have a happy, harmonious society based solidly upon universal reason on which everyone can agree. It sounds wonderful. Okay, the issue though is, and this is what Kuyper played an incredible role in doing, was that he said, well, humans are not rational animals, as Aristotle had said, rational beings. He said they are religious beings, not in the sense that they'll go around worshipping or like liturgies and stuff like that, but they're allegiant, they're creatures of allegiance, of commitment to what they take to be final and absolute, whatever that might be. And whatever that orientation is, whether to the true and living God or to idols or to aspects of creation, that is going to change all their thinking about everything. Okay, so the notion of a neutral, religiously neutral reason is a fiction. It isn't just very hard to get rid of all your prejudices about everything and be rational. It's impossible in principle. Now, up on my shelves there, Richard's got a copy now, Henry bought him, Herman Doivier's New Critique of Theoretical Thought. That argues that it's there is no such thing as neutral reason or theorizing, nor can there be, and puts forward powerful arguments for maintaining that position. Now, if you've got that, then you've got a basis for saying, the different positions with their various absolutes can systematically develop their positions. Okay? And Christianity also has a position which can be systematically developed. This, because of the commitment to that classical pagan and medieval view of reason, the very notion of Christian scholarship simply did not exist. All there could be was just good scholarship, honest scholarship based upon best arguments, best evidence, full stop. That's all there was. There couldn't be anything else. And don't bring in prejudices, extraneous things to the sphere of scholarship. You can have all your funny beliefs, but don't leave them at the door of the university when you come in to do proper scholarship, where proper objectivity and universal rationality reigns. Well, that was the dream coming right the way from early Greek philosophers right the way through. And that, of course, this is what, a few days before yesterday, a lot of, and starting in many ways with Nietzsche, a lot of secular scholars realized that this dream of reason was a phantom, a fiction, a fantasy. And so the dream of reason got labeled modernism. It's one of the labels. And of course, postmodernism is saying this idolatry of reason, we reject it. We reject it. It's a fiction. And so, if you read the postmodern authors, you'll have a view, this reason thing is impossible because at lots of levels, ontologically, in terms of what exists, reality is a complex flux. So the idea that you can sort of definitively grab hold of it, pin it down and say, this is it, is elusive. It slips through your fingers. It's greasy and slippery and ever-changing in its flux. And of course, that was the philosophical view of the early Greek philosophers, like Heraclitus. Reality is like an ever-flowing, tumbling lakeland stream.
Right, that cyclical view, yeah.
Ontologically, you've got that idea of flux. Nietzsche is very strong on that sort of idea. But then in terms of language with which you're going to name things, going to form your propositions and true statements about the world, postmodern view is the fluidity and indeterminacy of language. It's slippery, it's changing all the time. There's all sorts of meanings and sub-meanings and intertextual meanings and all sorts of things.
I'm very interested that it's the French, Richard, that the people who deified the goddess reason and literally had I think it was a whore go through the streets in the revolution dressed as reason. And, it's them that come, and we'll see this in later chapters with Schuman and France, la décadence that comes from that means that they are not in a position to fight in World War II. They have something like 70 cabinets in a few years, I don't know how many years, it wasn't very many. But also that they are the ones producing the postmodern philosophers who have essentially brought the rot to the West, which we now know and are experiencing through Western institutions. So it's quite shocking, but I know that Andy was going to chip something.
Yeah, just in this whole context of people looking at the Greco-Roman way of thinking and analysing that and liking it, I watched a really interesting interview with Tom Holland, the contemporary historian. He was discussing how much he loved it as a youngster, reading about the heroes and the Greeks and the Romans, and wasn't it wonderful, this masculine, strong man, hierarchical society. And as he's grown up and studied and learned more and more about the nature of what it was like in that society in those times, he realized actually there's a lot about it that he doesn't like, and there's a lot about it that he realizes it's very different in its way of thinking and its ethos and its whole build up than how he thinks. And he sort of started to realize actually the bedrock of it and the results of it is very different from what he likes in the West and the freedom that we have.
It's really good, especially the anti-democratic thing, because I really like that point, Andy, because you place yourself in those stories of one of the few 20 to 1% that are blessed by that system of governance of philosophy that get to do this stuff and forget about them, even more so than perhaps Western society today that got trampled to make that happen, or in the context in which they spoke. And so if we were to put ourselves as a random lot as one of those people in that time, the chances it would be better or treat us fairly we kind of take for granted that we would be the hero of the story, and we wouldn't. That's a really interesting point.
Just I mentioned that when Nietzsche was, I think he was professor of, was it classical philology? Is it?
Yeah. Philology, yeah.
Yes. When he was there was, when he was there, what was been happening in Britain had been all sorts of legislation, Wilberforce and Shaftesbury and those people, factory acts, not having children working or not having them under a certain age or limited hours, and all sorts of good things in that direction. And Britain was, in a way, sort of ahead of the curve in many ways in Europe at that time. And these issues came up in Switzerland or perhaps in the canton, I'm not quite sure whether, whatever. And Nietzsche took the line and, put his vote about keeping things as they were, because it was essential that people like him, were to be a leisured intellectual class who could make culture, and we had to have people at the bottom who knew their place.
Very Greek.
Who worked in factories and did the grubby, horrible jobs. And the idea that this underclass should start having a voice, start having a life, was intolerable. So basically, behind this was basically this adoration of classical culture, where slavery. Slaves did the work. Aristotle, in fact, one place said, "There's no need for any more inventions. No need for any inventions anymore. We got all we need. Besides, the slaves do the work. We just need more slaves. We need more wars, captives, slaves." And that solves the problem.
That's a horrendous conclusion to come to, isn't it? That aspect. Well, hopefully, in our little group is sort of slightly in opposition to that, having our blue collar scholars strapline. Henry, did you want to jump in? And then I know Richard wants to bring us on to the next topic. So we kind of got.
Yeah, that was it. I was thinking about more about the sort of moving on. So you have these negative influences as the kind of Christian thought world has been smashed by new ideas, and they're not prepared for it. And I noted also the English inconsistency. Was that Nietzsche quote? That is actually almost better than the German tendency. And I had this word dran nach dem Absoluten, to drive toward the absolute, which of course they did, and they explored and they dug the depths of these terrible ideologies, and to the point where that fueled with a kind of neo-paganism and a nationalism was absolutely toxic, as we saw. Yeah. And but then I was thinking, well, that's not the only influence there. And we see Kuyper, and of course Kuyper formed party with the Catholics in his day, didn't he? In the ARP, the Anti-Revolutionary Party. Yeah. And yet I notice in this chapter I actually bring in that Schumann's born into this very pious Catholic background in this quiet suburb of Luxembourg, and at the time it is the time of the great papal encyclicals Rerum Novarum and Catholic social teaching, which that is unexpected in one sense, particularly coming from the kind of pope that it came from. But he was obviously an extraordinary man, and they became like a bulwark against all of the stuff that we're talking about, and because it came to influence three men who would then effectively save us from World War III, save at least two nations from communism. And it's not capitalist stuff either, because as you'll see when we get to another chapter, this Pope writes something along the lines of, anything that you own beyond the needs of propriety belongs to the poor. So you don't get any, you can argue what propriety means and the needs of propriety, but at the end of the day, this is absolutely revolutionary. He pulls the rug out from rapacious capitalism and from the growing currents of socialism. So I just wondered whether you guys had picked that up and really
interesting. Thankfully, there was, I think, an Englishman who contributed to the writing of it, wasn't there? So it's not all flatheads and blockheads from our side of the channel as well. Richard Betts, I think you had some thoughts on that kind of Catholic influence in this century as well.
Thank you. I was glad, because we were talking about Robert Schuman. We want to land this back in Schuman, and his launchpad is very much Catholic thought. And there were two important Protestants who converted to Rome within that 100 years. First, there was Newman, who was an Anglican, and became Catholic. And he had a very good effect on Rome in the sense of getting Rome to think again when it was getting very decrepit. Well, that's my impression. He really put a shot in the arm, and he was one of the people behind Leo was Newman. The Fides et Ratio and Rerum Novarum, the big things from Leo in the 1890s as Schumann's growing up. A lot of that is the influence of Newman as the sort of court philosopher of the Vatican. So somebody goes from a Protestant background and brings in fresh blood into Catholic thought. And the other big one is another Protestant converted to Rome during Schumann's lifetime, a contemporary of Schuman, which is Jacques Maritain. And we'll be hearing more about him because he's an enormous influence on Schuman. But again, we have someone coming from Protestantism with all the self-confidence of a Protestant thinker, really giving Rome a massive shot in the arm in the early 20th century in its political thought. I thought those two were important. But I wanted to make a link to Richard, when you were installed as vicar in Bath. I remember the day when George Carey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, came and installed you, and I thought it was very prophetic of George that he preached.
He was merely the Bishop of Bath and Wells at that point.
Oh, was he?
Yes.
He was a bit of a hero of mine as a teenager, and he preached on Nehemiah. He identified you as like Nehemiah in the Old Testament, rebuilding the walls after the exile. So the people of Israel have been disobedient, they've been thrown out of their land, they've lost all their influence, they're powerless. And Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls so that they can come back and inhabit their temple and get some leverage again. And you've had that role, but I was thinking that's what we're really talking about, that Maritain, Schuman, these guys are, and Kuyper, and so many of the names we've talked about, Protestant and Catholic, they are rebuilders of walls, aren't they? Their whole trajectory is to give God's people, give the Christians within Europe some confidence back that they have a voice in the public square. So I thought it was important to bring in the Catholic influences on Schuman because that's what formed him.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, Henry, I wonder if maybe I could ask you kind of a question. We're kind of coming into land towards the end of the discussion. I think we'll probably have to draw to a close in a few minutes, if that's okay. So just thinking about kind of Schumann's faith trajectory. We've seen some similarities to Augustine perhaps in this chapter. Do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on that? Just kind of, as we're sort of setting out the early sort of start of Schumann's life, and maybe we're thinking about all these sort of philosophical impacts coming in and the historical impacts. But then what about his own kind of personal faith? Was there anything interesting that we can draw out there?
Well, it's a quiet upbringing. And yet, on the borders of the Shire, literally, the borders are changing around him. So I think we probably don't get that in England because we've not experienced it for a few hundred years, the thought of invasion. I know we've discussed this when we looked at the Isles. So I want you to imagine a young man growing up in this leafy suburb, very pious parents, particularly his mother. They're not entirely German, they're not entirely French. They speak Allemand. I want to get that idea of the non-fixity of borders around him, but this deep, wide Catholic spirituality which he's imbibing. I don't know. I don't ever think he went for any crisis of faith, and yet he does know this from an early age, as did Churchill. He was aware of a unique calling on his life because of the geographical situation. That is unusual, I think, that he understood that there was, some people call it a vocation or and he does try to enter a monastery, and it's through the Council of Friends after his mother dies that he doesn't. Like Augustine, the mother's influence is incredibly important. He's like his own university research department eventually, but his mother is fueling him with books intellectually. Wow. So a bit
that
like
is actually a really, really, really fascinating point. So as you might know, I'm studying business, and I just had my last module of lectures sort of over the weekend, and it was very philosophical actually. So it was about leadership and the art of judgment, and we looked at Shakespeare and Aristotle and virtue ethics and stuff. But that point about leaders came up as well. So narcissism and where that might come from, but also psychologically too. And the point about parents is, I think, actually really important. So there was a fascinating quote in one of the articles. I think it was a Harvard Business Review article with a guy called De Vries, I think, who said that people have different, individual life stories of how they get to where they get to, but often leaders who have got to a particularly high position have had a very strong and influential mother, and the father's relationship has an impact on that as well. but if you can kind of track the relationship for men anyway, particularly if they've had a strong mother figure in their life, then that often has a really kind of significant impact on their career trajectory as well.
That's
Great.
Right.
Thanks everyone. So it's getting quite late. Obviously on YouTube you'll be watching this at your own time around the world, but for us we're kind of midweek here in the UK. So I'll maybe ask if anyone has any kind of final points, and then just bring this into
just mention
Richard Russell, please do. Yes.
Diagrams, lots of diagrams.
Oh, wow.
If you go to the website All of Life Redeemed, or one word, .co.uk, I think it is. There's about 40 diagrams there with some commentary and stuff like that. I'd be very interested if you had a look at them. I'd love some comeback, because I'm trying to write a book with a sort of short commentary on each diagram. Unless I can make a diagram, I don't understand it. But then if I can make a diagram, I can teach it to anyone at any level.
One dyslexic to another, I can assure you it is absolutely the way we think, spatially.
It makes a difference.
Yeah, I remember Richard giving me this, Richard Russell, sitting in my laundry with me many years ago. Do you remember that? And I actually had one of your diagrams pinned on the laundry wall for years.
Amazing, thank you. So that's it for this episode from our neurodiverse Blue Collar Scholar Collective podcast. We've looked at Chapter 3 of Saving Europe by Henry Vyner-Brooks, looking at the Imago Dei and how Christian philosophy impacted on cultural shifts in the early 19th century, but then how a trend towards secularism impacted on an abyss of the 20th century in Europe. We've been privileged to have Richard Russell with us this evening, mentor to our own Richard Betts, and we've really enjoyed hearing his thoughts on Nietzsche. Hit subscribe, make sure you get the notifications going, and we're looking forward to having you join us again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you. Well done, guys.
Remember also that this journey was part of the research for a book which uses the lives of Columbanus and Schuman
to explore the unlikely arrival, survival, victory and atrophy of European civilization.
Do follow the links below to find out more.
Please let us know what you thought of this episode, what you liked, what you didn't, what was new to you. Just start a conversation below in the comments section. And of course, if you found the content helpful, then we're pretty sure you're going to like this next one suggested here. But also while you're there, don't forget to help us by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.